It began, as most inconvenient spiritual inquiries do, with a cold draught slipping beneath an ancient wooden door, one of those medieval breezes that somehow carried more judgment than actual wind, a breeze that whispered with a slightly accusatory tone. So, you think you understand devotion, do you? And perhaps you, lying there in your bed with your blanket pulled up to your chin, feel a similar touch of that cold, ecclesiastical breath. Not because your room is cold, but because questions, real questions, always arrive with the temperature of stone chapels at midnight. Tonight, in the dim hush of these unfolding hours, we begin with a question that no scholar, monk, priest, or sleep-deprived philosopher thought important enough to ask aloud. Yet every one of them secretly wondered while shivering through their nightly prayers. How, in the name of drafty sanctity, did priests sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death? A modest curiosity, yes, but also an existential catastrophe, because when one is wrapped in faith but not in blankets, one discovers the true nature of spiritual endurance. And let us be honest, God may be omnipotent, but he has never been particularly generous with central heating. You can picture it already. A stone chamber exhaling cold like a resentful saint, the moon slicing through a sliver in the window, dust dancing in the air like uncommitted angels too lazy to descend. A priest lies in his bed, if that wooden bench with hay qualifies as bed, and pulls a thin blanket over his trembling body, muttering a prayer that sounds more like a complaint. Not the noble kind recited in illuminated manuscripts, but the sort whispered by a tired soul negotiating directly with eternity. Lord, I understand trials, but must they include frostbite? And in that moment, there, between the creaks of ancient wood and the slow drip of melting candle wax, you can almost hear the cosmos laugh. Not a cruel laugh, no. More like the soft, ironic chuckle of a god who has watched humans invent monasteries in the coldest possible locations, and then wonder why they are cold. But tonight, in this story shaped by shadows, incense, and a touch of theological sarcasm, we will wander deeper into the mystery, not just of freezing priests, but of faith itself, that complicated blanket that never quite covers the feet. You and I, dear listener, yes, you settling into your pillow while pretending you're not already drifting, are about to follow a priest whose nights were colder than his doubts, and whose doubts were colder than the walls that held him. But worry not. This tale is wrapped in humor as dry as old parchment and just as flammable. Before we descend fully into the candle-lit absurdity, let us acknowledge something important, with appropriate ceremonial irony. Before you settle in pretending this is just background noise, do the holy thing. Like the video and subscribe. Only if you feel called by. The algorithmic divine, of course. Now, breathe gently as the medieval torches flicker. Listen to the silence thickening like old theology. The night is long, the corridors echo with footsteps that may or may not be yours, and faith, well, faith is just a warm thought trying its best in a cold world. Our priest waits in the darkness, shivering, praying, doubting, freezing, believing, and somehow still alive. Shall we step into his world? He lived, if one can call such shivering a form of life, in a monastery half forgotten by God and entirely forgotten by comfortable architecture. His name, whispered through corridors that always smelled faintly of wet stone and theological regret, was Father Aurelian. Not the famous kind of priest whose relics glow suspiciously or whose sermons are quoted in dusty classrooms. No, Aurelian was the sort of priest who prayed more out of muscle memory than mystical fervor, the kind whose faith flickered like the last candle in a chapel where the windows refused to close properly, the kind who, if we are being honest, would have sold half his rosaries for a decent wool blanket. His monastery perched on a cliffside, a magnificent location chosen by some spiritually ambitious ancestor who believed closeness to heaven meant physical elevation. Unfortunately, they had not considered that altitude, while good for birds and metaphors, was catastrophically bad for warmth. The wind arrived every evening with the hostile persistence of an overly devout pilgrim, slipping under robes, under doors, under eyelids, as though searching for sins to report. Aurelian, every night, walked the stone hallway toward his cell. Cell being the affectionate medieval term for a room that was slightly larger than a coffin and only marginally more comfortable. His sandals clicked softly, each step echoing with the resigned rhythm of a man who has made peace with discomfort, but not with the reason for it. Candles, perched on iron brackets that had rusted into the shape of permanent suffering, trembled and sputtered as if praying for release. And always, always, there was incense, the universal medieval attempt to cover the smell of everything else. From the outside, Aurelian's life looked impressive. He wore heavy robes the color of solemnity. He spoke in tones reserved for people who knew Latin irregular verbs. He woke before dawn, which, in medieval terms, meant just before the frost fully committed. He swept floors with a humility that might have impressed the saints, if saints were the kind to care about sweeping. He lit candles with ritual precision, although he sometimes wondered if God ever noticed the difference between a careful flame and a hasty one. And he prayed. Oh, how he prayed! He prayed in the morning, when his breath rose like reluctant incense. He prayed at midday, mostly to distract himself from the fact that the monastery's meal was often a philosophical reinterpretation of the concept of food. He prayed at sunset, when shadows stretched across the courtyard like tired angels reporting for their night shift, and he prayed at night, in his narrow wooden bed, whispering petitions into the gloom, with the weary conviction of someone who wasn't entirely sure if the prayer warmed the soul or merely delayed the frostbite. The irony, of course, is that Aurelian believed profoundly in structure. Not divine structure, that one he suspected was eternally under renovation, but in human structure, the schedule, the rituals, the duties that made life feel orderly, even when the universe clearly was not. But believing in structure is one thing. Being saved by it is another. And every evening, when he curled into the thin blanket that barely remembered being wool, structure did nothing against the cold reality of medieval physics. Still, he had dignity. A dignity made of silence and candle smoke. A dignity that said, yes, I may be freezing, but I am freezing with purpose. The monastery itself exhaled stories. The tapestries, faded and moth-bitten, depicted saints so elongated they looked like theological noodles. The courtyard fountain had not produced actual water since some winter decades ago, when it had frozen solid and decided it preferred that state. The library held volumes so ancient that even the dust contemplated retirement. And the chapel, Aurelian's sanctuary, held a crucifix that watched him with the patient expression of someone who knew everything and said nothing. He often wondered whether that silence was holy or simply indifferent. Every night, as he walked to his cell, he passed Brother Marius, the monastery's most enthusiastic believer in unnecessary suffering. Marius always greeted him with, "Brother, the cold strengthens the soul." to which Aurelian always replied, internally, that my soul must be a bodybuilder by now. The truth was simple. Aurelian had grown accustomed to the cold, not because he liked it, but because his body no longer remembered warmth. And in that numbness, a peculiar sort of faith had taken root, not the bold, shining kind praised in Scripture, but the quiet, practical kind that whispers, "Just make it through the night, and tomorrow we'll pretend to make sense again." One night, perhaps the one we are stepping into now, Aurelian paused outside his cell. The moonlight carved itself through the narrow window, illuminating the dust swirling in the air like tiny monks refusing to settle. The silence pressed against him, heavy, thoughtful, patient. He inhaled the incense lingering from evening prayers, its smoky curl wrapping around his senses like a tired blessing, and he stepped inside. His bed awaited him like a test of character. The rough straw mattress, generously donated by a particularly unforgiving patch of earth, crackled beneath him. The blanket, thin as theological evidence, barely reached his ankles. The walls stared with the cold indifference of stone that had never known compassion. Aurelian sighed, a sound that held centuries of monastic resignation. Then he whispered a prayer that was half devotion, half negotiation. "Lord, if you insist on testing me, perhaps a slightly warmer test." Outside, the wind answered, lifting the corner of his blanket with the smug confidence of a spirit who knew exactly how cold the night would be. And so, Aurelian lay there, wrapped in faith, doubt, and the unmistakable sensation of slowly becoming an icicle wearing a robe. But his world, this monastery of shadows and incense, would soon tremble, for faith, like cold, seeps in slowly, and doubt often follows the same path. And you, listening in your dim room, might find the edge of your own blanket warming as his begins to freeze. Before the night began slipping its cold fingers beneath his collar, before the drafts argued with him more than the other monks did, before he felt the slow creeping suspicion that the silence of heaven might be less mysterious and more unattended mailbox, Father Aurelian had once possessed a faith that glowed, quietly, politely, like a candle that didn't want to offend the darkness too much. Not a fiery faith. Not the kind that sent saints into deserts or inspired prophets to shout on mountaintops. No, Aurelian believed in a way that was manageable. A flame that warmed but did not burn. A conviction that reassured but never contradicted him. The sort of faith that made him feel safe, like a child wrapped in a blanket woven from sacred stories, and just enough theological certainty to sleep soundly. He had believed in miracles, yes, but in the same way one believes in seasonal discounts or rare astrological alignments, earnestly, but always with a convenient touch of, well, if it doesn't happen, God probably meant it metaphorically. He had believed in angels, too, though in Aurelian's imagination they were usually tired, slightly overworked bureaucrats who filed celestial paperwork until dawn, and occasionally misplaced a blessing or two. Angels, he assumed, must sigh often. The universe, after all, was full of souls demanding things they themselves didn't understand. And prayer. Ah, prayer. He had once prayed like a man whispering into a well, entirely confident that someone, somewhere, was listening and diligently jotting down his requests in a divine ledger. He imagined God reviewing those notes at the end of each week, perhaps with a cup of eternal tea, murmuring, "Aurelian again? He does love asking for clarity, doesn't he?" But the truth is that Aurelian's faith before the cold nights of doubt was deeply poetic. He felt God in the drifting incense, in the soft clatter of rosary beads, in the pages of old psalters that smelled faintly of hope and mildew. He saw holiness in simple things, the first spark of a candle in the morning, the murmur of monks chanting in unison, the echo of footsteps in the stone cloister at dawn. These were the moments that shaped him, gently, like a potter's hands shaping clay that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to become a cup or a philosophical vase. His heart, bless it, was much warmer then. Not wise yet, but eager. Not serene, but hopeful. Not profound, but beautifully naive. And oh, how sincerely he believed that sincerity was enough. He clung to Scripture as though it were a quilt woven by God Himself. Every verse felt like a thread of divine warmth wrapping lightly around his existence. Even the verses he didn't understand, which, if we're honest, were more than he admitted, felt comforting simply because they were mysterious. Mystique, after all, makes ignorance feel noble. In those earlier days, Aurelian believed his life had purpose, clear purpose, sacred purpose. He believed each morning's prayer reached heaven. He believed each bowed head meant something within the eternal machinery. He believed every small gesture, lighting candles, offering blessings, reading psalms, contributed to an invisible tapestry woven by divine fingers. And truly, he believed that faith was like insulation against life's cold drafts, a warm coat woven from trust, a shield against uncertainty, a spiritual hearth fire for the soul. The irony, of course, is that for all his beliefs, Aurelian failed to notice that his faith was already fragile, too dependent on comfort, too sensitive to disruption, too polite to survive an honest crisis. It was the faith of someone who thought the universe would always bend gently toward him simply because he behaved well. He thought faith was strengthened by ritual repetition, not by the storms that tear ritual apart. He thought devotion was a smooth road, not a cliffside path overlooking the abyss. He thought God was predictable, which is always the first mistake. But the most delicate illusion of all, the one he treasured more than he realized, was that he believed warmth was natural to the soul, that God's presence felt like heat, that certainty was comfortable, that holiness meant never shivering, never doubting, never waking in the night with a quiet gasp, and the sudden understanding that the universe might not be as orderly as he hoped. In those earlier years, Aurelian's faith was like a well-made tapestry hung carefully on a wall, beautiful, impressive, comforting to look at, but only a tapestry, never tested by wind, never soaked in storm, never torn, never stitched back together with trembling hands. He did not yet know that faith, real faith, is a wild creature, tooth and wing and uncertainty, something that bites before it blesses, something that demands the soul freeze, thaw, and freeze again. But all he knew then, in the warmth of ignorance, was this: he believed, with simplicity, with tenderness, with a heart still unfractured. He did not know that cracks were already forming, hairline fractures in the stained glass of his convictions, each one invisible until the cold nights arrived, carrying the kind of doubt that creeps into the bed long before you dare to name it. He did not know that his warm, comfortable faith was about to meet the colder, sharper truth of his existence. And you, yes, you, listening in the dark, might recognize that warmth, might remember your own soft certainties before the first shiver of doubt, before the questions began whispering at the edges of your thoughts, before the universe began clearing its throat in that politely ominous way it does before everything changes. Aurelian's faith, once gentle and luminous, was about to face its first real winter. And winter is honest, brutally, beautifully honest. The first fracture in Aurelian's faith did not descend like thunder from the heavens, nor erupt in a flaming prophecy delivered by an ecstatic hermit in the chapel doorway. No, nothing so dramatic. Instead, it arrived with the subtlety of a tired sigh, the kind a soul gives only when it is too polite to interrupt the quiet. It began on a night that seemed even colder than usual, though Aurelian suspected the night simply enjoyed exaggerating its own suffering. He had just finished Compline, the final prayer of the day, that solemn, sleepy ritual where half the monks whispered their psalms to avoid waking their doubts. Candles flickered with the delicate panic of flames, aware they were the only source of warmth within several miles. Aurelian bowed his head, the shadows stretching long and thin around him, as though the darkness itself were eavesdropping. When he lifted his head again, he noticed something odd, barely noticeable, like a wrinkle in the fabric of reality. The large wooden crucifix at the front of the chapel seemed different. Not wrong, not broken, just tilted, ever so slightly. As though Christ himself had shifted his weight out of boredom or exasperation. Aurelian blinked, slowly, very slowly. The crucifix remained stubbornly tilted at the faintest, most insolent angle. And it was absurd. Entirely, thoroughly absurd. Because Aurelian knew the monks tightened those bolts every year during Lent, as if ensuring Jesus was properly aligned would increase their own chances of salvation. Yet here he was, the savior of mankind, leaning like a tavern patron, listening in on a secret. Aurelian stared, and the crucifix, in all its divine silence, stared back. That was the moment the seed slipped in, not with force or fear, but with a question so delicate it almost felt kind. What if nothing is as straight as you think? He told himself it was nothing. Just wood, just gravity, just one of the monks leaning too hard during dusting. Yes, dusting. The holiest of monastic accidents. But as he walked back to his cell, the thought followed him through the corridors like a soft phantom. It hovered between the candle flames. It rustled the edges of the tapestries. It drifted beneath his robe like an inquisitive breeze. And then came the dream. That night, Aurelian fell asleep almost instantly, a rare blessing in the monastery, where sleep usually required a negotiation with at least 3 draughts, 1 mouse, and the echo of Brother Marius snoring 2 halls away. But sleep took him quickly, like a gentle abduction, and soon he drifted into a dream soaked in incense and confusion. He stood in the chapel, alone. Or perhaps not alone, not exactly. The crucifix before him was alive, not in the glorious, miraculous sense one might expect, but in the way a painting breathes when its subject has thoughts it refuses to share. Christ looked down at him, not with sorrow, not with compassion, but with a subtle, unmistakable expression of annoyance. Aurelian opened his mouth to ask something, anything, but the Christ of his dream spoke first, lifting his head just enough to make his disapproval very clear. "You keep praying for warmth," the dream Christ murmured, his voice echoing like wind across stone. "But you never close the window." Aurelian, baffled, glanced to his left. Sure enough, an open stone window let in a freezing blast of winter air. "But I didn't open it," he protested. "Exactly," Christ sighed. "You assume comfort is my job." And then, just as Aurelian's dream mind attempted to form a theological argument worthy of saints and scholars, the crucifix leaned even further to one side, much further, comically further, as though the Lord himself were tired of being symmetrical. Aurelian's eyes snapped open. His room was dark and quiet. Except, of course, his window was open. Wide open. The wind rushed in like a judgmental choir, and Aurelian, shivering violently, whispered into the darkness, but I didn't open it. He rose from bed, wrapped the blanket around his shoulders like a monk-shaped burrito, and pushed the window closed with both hands. The latch resisted, as though it had grown fond of spiritual chaos. And there it was, the seed, planted, growing. Not a doubt in God, no, that would come later, with much more flair, but a doubt in himself, in his perceptions, in the quiet mechanics of his faith. He climbed back into bed, but now the straw felt different, sharper, somehow, as though each piece had developed a personal opinion about him. The room pressed in. The shadows deepened. The silence seemed to listen, patiently, like a confessor waiting for a sin that had not yet learned its own name. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself dreams were ordinary. He told himself windows opened by accident. He told himself wood expands and crucifixes tilt. He told himself many things. But doubt, real doubt, arrives not as a shout, but as a whisper. Not as thunder, but as a draft beneath the door. Not as a crisis, but as a tiny suspicion that something, somewhere, is slightly off. And once noticed, it refuses to leave. Even now, centuries later, as you lie in your own soft bed, you might feel that same whisper, that quiet, persistent suspicion in the back of your mind, that gentle tug at the corner of your certainty, that tilt, barely perceptible, in the structure of your beliefs. Aurelian felt it, and though he tried to ignore it, it would only grow, quietly, firmly, lovingly even, like a cold hand pressing against the warm center of his soul. Aurelian awoke the next morning with the stubborn conviction of a man determined to pretend that absolutely nothing unusual had happened. It was a spiritual talent he had cultivated over the years, this exquisite ability to bury the strange beneath the routine, to smother curiosity with ritual, to drown discomfort beneath a tidal wave of pious busywork. And so, as he stretched beneath his insufficient blanket, feeling every bone articulate its frost-bitten disapproval, he declared internally with heroic delusion, "Today I shall be exceptionally devout. Yes, that will fix everything. Never mind the window. Never mind the dream Christ with excellent comedic timing. Never mind the crucifix leaning like a divine afterthought. Never mind that he had woken with a cold so deep it seemed to have opinions. Faith, Aurelian decided, would be his shield, and denial, well, denial would be his warmest blanket. He rose from bed with unnecessary enthusiasm, as though standing too quickly would frighten doubt back into whatever crevice it had crawled from. The floor, predictably, was freezing. Not cold, freezing, like the stones had quietly conspired overnight to form a small glacial system under his feet. But he ignored that, too, because ignoring was holy now. He dressed with ceremonial precision. Everything was exaggerated. The sweeping motion of pulling his robe over his shoulders, the dramatic adjustment of his rope belt, the deliberate straightening of his hood, as though he were preparing for a portrait in a manuscript no one would ever read. He splashed water on his face, ice water, naturally, and inhaled sharply as though divinity lived in thermal shock. He whispered to himself, "See, I am fine. Absolutely fine. The Lord rewards dedication and excessive optimism." He marched into the corridor with the stride of a man who believed God appreciated good posture. The morning bells rang, dull, heavy, echoing through the monastery like a reminder that time kept moving forward, whether he understood anything or not. Brother Marius spotted him immediately, because of course he did. "A blessed morning, Brother Aurelian," Marius shouted. with the volume of someone who believed the angels were hard of hearing. "You look rather radiant today." Aurelian considered for a brief moment whether the word radiant was code for, "You look like a man trying too hard." But he dismissed the thought with the serenity of someone who refused to interpret anything realistically. "Thank you, brother. I am embracing divine vigor today." "Ah, excellent," Marius replied. "A soul warmed by God needs no earthly heat." Aurelian smiled, a tight, thin smile that could have frozen midair if he'd exhaled too hard. Indeed, heat is overrated. And then he hurried along before Marius could recommend another round of voluntary suffering for spiritual strengthening. Morning prayers were Aurelian's opportunity, his grand spiritual theater, to prove to himself that nothing was wrong. He knelt on the cold stone floor so quickly that the impact surely impressed at least 3 saints. He bowed his head with such eagerness that it almost qualified as athletic devotion. The chanting began, low, solemn, repetitive, the perfect soundtrack for a man attempting to drown his own thoughts. Aurelian sang louder than usual, which was not to say loud, but loud for him, which meant some monks near him glanced over in mild theological alarm. He inhaled incense deeply, too deeply, so deeply that he nearly coughed, which would have broken the illusion of serene piety. So he swallowed the cough like a secret sin. He clasped his hands together tightly, as if squeezing each fingertip would manually compress the previous night into nothingness. He prayed with fervor, "Lord, thank you for your guidance, for your warmth, for your clarity." He paused. Warmth. Not the wisest choice of words. "For your metaphorical warmth," he corrected discreetly, "your symbolic warmth. Your warmth that transcends physical sensation. Your warmth that is less temperature-based." The monk beside him shot him a confused glance. Aurelian smiled serenely, as if this cascading correction was a normal theological nuance. When the prayers ended, he stood up too quickly again. His knees made a sound that suggested they were considering excommunication. He ignored this as well, because spiritual denial has excellent flexibility. During morning chores, Aurelian took denial to unprecedented heights. He polished candlesticks with such aggressive devotion that one of the younger monks quietly asked if perhaps Aurelian was fighting invisible demons. Aurelian responded with a serene smile and a flourish of his polishing cloth, whispering, "Cleanliness is next to holiness. But internally, if I shine enough brass, perhaps God will shine clarity on me. Or maybe heat. Heat would be nice." He swept the cloister walkway so thoroughly that he removed not only dust, but possibly a few layers of stone. He organized the library shelves so meticulously that future librarians would curse his name for disrupting the established chaos. He trimmed candle wicks with surgical precision, trimming the doubts that still flickered in the corners of his mind. Every act was exaggerated, every movement overly pious, every gesture swollen with the desperation of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. The monks noticed. Brother Stephen whispered to Brother Abel, "Aurelian seems unusually energetic today." Brother Abel nodded. A sign of spiritual renewal, perhaps? Brother Stephen frowned. Or of spiritual panic. Aurelian, passing nearby, pretended he hadn't heard that last part. Panic? No, absolutely not. Panic is what amateurs feel. I, on the other hand, am simply profoundly enthusiastic. He smiled even more, stretching his lips into a shape the human face was never meant to achieve. At midday meal, Aurelian blessed his food with theatrical flair. He prayed so long that the soup grew cold, colder, actually, which was impressive considering the soup had begun at a temperature best described as repentant snow. He thanked God for the vegetables, the bowl, the spoon, the table, the concept of nourishment, the act of digestion itself. He thanked God for silence, for the privilege of monastic life, for the opportunity to serve, for the miracle of breath, for the beauty of discipline. He was halfway through thanking God for invisible virtues when Brother Marius interrupted politely. "Brother Aurelian, the rest of us would like to begin eating." Aurelian blinked, smiled, and said, "Of course, we must nourish the body as we nourish the soul." He raised his spoon. His hand trembled, not from divine awe, but from the cold, from the memory of the dream, from the slight, irresistible tilt of a crucifix. He clenched the spoon harder to stop the trembling. It only rattled louder against the bowl, so he pretended it was enthusiasm, devout trembling, a sacred vibration. The monks nodded politely, as monks do when they suspect a brother is slightly unhinged but still functional. The afternoon brought scriptural study, the perfect opportunity for Aurelian to hide inside theological commentary so dense it could crush any inconvenient thought. He opened a manuscript with the reverence of a man opening a portal to safety. He read, he underlined, he annotated, he cross-referenced. He did everything except absorb anything. His eyes moved across the page like a pilgrim walking through fog. Every passage seemed to speak to him, but the messages, the messages were inconveniently ambiguous. "For those who seek, a sign shall be given," the scripture whispered. Aurelian frowned. Hadn't he been given something? But then he read further. "Do not interpret lightly the movements of the divine." He closed the manuscript. Perhaps studying wasn't helping. By evening, Aurelian was exhausted. Not physically, no. Physical exhaustion was familiar, almost comforting, but spiritually. Denial takes energy, especially when it must be performed with monastic dignity. He dragged himself toward Compline once more, determined to finish the day with triumphant piety. His candles burned perfectly. His robe fell in ideal folds. His expression was one of transcendent serenity. And as he knelt before the crucifix, he noticed something. It was straight again, perfectly straight, as if nothing had ever been amiss. Aurelian nearly laughed. Nearly, because laughter in chapel is generally frowned upon unless one has achieved sainthood or madness. "See," he told himself, "everything is normal. No need to question, no need to worry. God has restored order. The universe is symmetrical once more, faith triumphant, doubt defeated." But then the faintest crack echoed behind the altar, a whisper of shifting wood, the crucifix tilting, no more than the width of a breath, just enough to be undeniably real. Aurelian froze. His heart stopped. His denial cracked. Only for a second, but 1 second was enough. He swallowed hard and whispered the holiest lie a man can tell himself. "I didn't see that." And thus began the brilliant negation, the last glow of a candle fighting the wind, the desperate, beautiful, doomed attempt to hold certainty in a world that had already begun to tilt. The days that followed were a tapestry woven with threads of confusion, embroidered carefully and inconveniently by the universe. Aurelian, with his newly perfected denial polished to a saintly shine, tried to glide through his monastic duties with the serene confidence of a man who absolutely, unquestionably, categorically did not have a problem. But the world, or God, or chance, or the mischievous bureaucracy of the heavens had other plans, and so the signs began. Not grand enough to be miracles, not subtle enough to be ignored, just problematic. The first sign appeared at breakfast. Aurelian sat at the long wooden table with his bowl of porridge, porridge being the medieval culinary equivalent of moral humility, when he noticed a peculiar pattern forming on its surface. At first it was just a swirl, then a shape, then a very vague but disturbingly familiar outline. 2 eyes, a mouth, a long nose. Brother Abel leaned over, squinting. "Is that a face?" Aurelian stiffened. No, it's steam, or porridge entropy." But the face stared back at him with the resigned expression of a saint who had been painted too many times and was tired of the attention. Abel whispered, "Looks like Brother Martius." Of course it did. Everything in the monastery looked like Brother Martius. He had one of those faces that practically haunted stonework. But that wasn't the issue. The issue was that the face winked. Aurelian blinked, then blinked again. The face dissolved. Abel shrugged. "You should eat quicker. Porridge gets ideas if you let it sit." Aurelian laughed nervously. Indeed. Of course. Inside. Absolutely not. I am not dealing with prophetic porridge." He buried his spoon into the bowl with the desperation of a man trying to smother destiny beneath oats. The second sign occurred in the library. Aurelian had sought refuge there, among parchment, dust, and the familiar scent of decaying knowledge. He inhaled deeply, comforted by the smell of old theology, which carried hints of ink, mildew, and centuries of unresolved arguments. He pulled a manuscript from the shelf. Meditations on Divine Certainty, a book he hoped would blunt the sharp edge of his growing confusion. He opened it. The first page read, "Do not ignore what tilts." Aurelian slammed the book shut. He opened it again. The page now read, "In times of doubt, return to the source." This was no better. He flipped to a random page. There are no accidents, only unread messages. Aurelian closed the manuscript and whispered, "This is unusually unhelpful." He placed the book back on the shelf. Another book immediately fell off, directly onto his foot. It was titled, "The Nature of Signs and Misinterpretations." He stared at it. It stared back, smugly. He left the library. The third sign appeared during his afternoon walk through the cloister garden, a patch of overworked soil and frostbitten shrubs that the monks optimistically called Eden. Aurelian wandered between the frozen rose bushes, reciting prayers under his breath, letting their rhythm calm the tremor of his thoughts. A raven perched on the stone wall beside him, a big one, with a stare so intense it bordered on theological interrogation. Ravens were common, but this one had attitude. It tilted its head, as if evaluating Aurelian's soul and finding it a bit messy. "Hello there," Aurelian whispered politely. The raven croaked, loudly, insistently. Then, with slow, deliberate menace, it hopped 3 times. Hop, hop, hop. Aurelian frowned. "Is that symbolic?" The raven croaked again, this time with unmistakable judgment, then flew away, leaving Aurelian with a heart pounding far too quickly for a man whose only predator was his own imagination. He sighed. Birds should not be cryptic. The fourth sign was the worst, because it was absurd, utterly, cosmically absurd. It happened during supper. Aurelian sat alone at the far end of the table, quietly contemplating the universe through the medium of slightly burnt bread. He lifted his slice to take a bite, and froze. On the charred surface, a pattern had formed. Not just any pattern, a face. Again. But this time it was undeniably recognizable. St. Augustine, or perhaps St. Benedict, or possibly the baker. Medieval art was very forgiving when it came to accuracy. Brother Stephen leaned in, eyes widening. "Does your bread contain holy imagery. Aurelian whispered sharply, "Do not start." But it looks sacred. It looks burnt. But the eyes, coincidence. The halo, heat bubble. Is it a blessing? Aurelian exhaled with saintly irritation. It is bread. Bread does not bless people. At that precise moment, the bread split in half, cleanly, as if cut by invisible scissors. The monastery gasped. Aurelian whispered, "Lord, please." Brother Stephen inhaled sharply. "A miracle!" Aurelian hissed. "No, not a miracle, not remotely." Stephen nodded solemnly. "A test, then." Aurelian pinched the bridge of his nose. "I am going to eat this bread," he announced. "And then I am going to bed. And tomorrow everyone will forget this." And he did eat it. And it tasted like guilt and wheat. But the fifth sign, oh, the fifth sign, was the one that truly broke him a little. It was night, late night. The monastery was silent except for the wind whispering its eternal commentary through the cracks in the stone walls. Aurelian lay in his bed, wrapped tightly in his insufficient blanket, staring up at the ceiling with the resignation of a man who expected no more surprises. And then, a soft tap, 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 tap. He sat up. Tap, tap. The sound came from the door. "Who is it?" he whispered. Tap. Slowly, he stood, the blanket trailing behind him like a tired cape. He opened the door. No one, nothing, except on the floor a single piece of parchment. He picked it up, unrolled it. It read, in handwriting that might have belonged to a monk or to an angel with questionable penmanship, "Stop pretending you are not noticing." Aurelian froze. His breath caught. He looked left, right, down the hall. Nothing. Not a soul, not a whisper, not even a draft. He closed the door slowly, leaned against it, and whispered into the darkness, "Why? Why are the signs so vague?" Because the signs weren't the kind that inspired instant enlightenment. They were the kind that made you question your sanity, the kind that made you wonder if you were being nudged by the divine, or pranked by the universe, or simply losing your grip on certainty one symbolic breakfast at a time. The worst part. Each sign could be explained if he tried hard enough. And he did try, desperately. The porridge, heat patterns. Probably. The library, coincidence. Books fall, gravity exists. The raven, just a bird with personality. The bread, random scorch marks. Probably, possibly, hopefully. The parchment, no explanation felt satisfying. None felt safe. None felt true. Because the truth is this: the universe rarely speaks clearly. It prefers hints, whispers, ambiguous nudges, symbols without manuals, mysteries without footnotes. And faith, real faith, must wrestle with interpretation. And doubt, real doubt, feeds on symbols that refuse to define themselves. Aurelian lay awake far into the night, staring at the parchment lying on his bedside table, illuminated by the trembling glow of a single candle. The words hovered in his mind like an unwelcome blessing. "Stop pretending you are not noticing." "Oh," he whispered softly, almost laughing, almost crying. "I notice. Believe me, I notice." But noticing was not the same as understanding. And understanding, well, understanding was still hiding somewhere between the cold drafts and the signs that refused to make sense. And this was only the beginning. By the time the fifth sign had carved its uneasy groove into Aurelian's soul, the delicate architecture of his denial had begun to tremble. Not collapse, no, Aurelian was still too proud, too trained, too monastic to crumble so quickly. But tremble, yes. A soft, persistent vibration beneath the surface of his days. The kind that starts in the bones and makes its way, inevitably, to the mind. It was subtle at first, the shift. A hesitation in his prayers, a tightening in his breath, a faint, unmistakable suspicion that the universe had begun whispering behind his back. But the signs, helpful as a cryptic riddle printed in smudged ink, were merely the opening act. The real descent began when the rituals, the sacred routines that held his world together, started to falter. And nothing terrifies a monk more than a ritual that refuses to behave. It started with the candles. Candles in monasteries are supposed to behave. They burn, they flicker, they melt into obedient pools of wax. They do not, under any theological interpretation, ignite with unreasonable enthusiasm. Yet that morning, as Aurelian lit the row of candles along the chapel altar, the flames responded like overzealous choir boys seeking praise. Each wick bloomed into flame too quickly, too brightly, flaring upward in a thin, startling column before settling into a trembling, oversized glow. Brother Stephen gasped. Brother Abel crossed himself. Brother Marius muttered something about the Holy Spirit being in a particularly expressive mood. Aurelian, meanwhile, stared at the flames with an expression best described as politely horrified. He whispered, "Please, just behave. Please." The flames flickered in unison, mocking him, he felt. He tried again the next day. Same result. Third day, same. Fourth, same. Until finally Brother Abel remarked softly, "Brother Aurelian, perhaps the candles are responding to you." Aurelian stiffened. "That is impossible. Candles do not respond to people." Abel shrugged. "Everything responds to something." Aurelian walked away, clutching the candle snuffer like a man gripping the frayed edge of normalcy. The second failure came from the choir. Aurelian had always taken quiet pride in his modest, steady voice, a voice that contributed gently to the chant, without calling attention to itself. He was neither a singer nor a disaster. He existed musically in that pleasant middle ground monks aspire to. But one evening, during Vespers, something strange occurred. They sang the usual hymn, O Lux Beatissima, their voices rising like thin threads of smoke. Aurelian inhaled, opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Nothing. No note, no whisper, not even the faintest exhale. His throat constricted as though an invisible hand had pressed it lightly, gently, but firmly against his voice. He tried again. Silence. He coughed discreetly. Tried again. Silence. Brother Stephan glanced over, concerned. Brother Marius glanced over, delighted. Brother Abel whispered, "Are you unwell?" Aurelian forced a thin breath and croaked, No, I don't know." His heart beat too quickly. His palms dampened. His throat felt foreign, incapable, as if the sacred words themselves had taken a temporary leave of absence. When the chant ended, Aurelian fled the chapel under the guise of spiritual contemplation, retreating to a quiet alcove where he pressed his back to the cold stone wall and whispered, barely audible, "Why is this happening?" The silence answered in the same way it always does, without the courtesy of explanation. The third failure was worse, because it happened during confession. Aurelian sat in the small wooden booth, the familiar scent of dust, incense, and ancient regret hanging in the air. He heard the penitent enter on the other side, kneel, and begin the ritual greeting. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Aurelian waited for the usual list. A stolen loaf of bread, a harsh word spoken, perhaps a minor envy over Brother Martius's surprisingly warm-looking socks. But instead, the penitent whispered, trembling, "I saw something." "Something?" Aurelian repeated softly. "In the chapel," the voice continued. "The crucifix moved." Aurelian froze. His spine stiffened. His breath stalled in his throat. Cold spread across his skin like a revelation, or like dread disguised as revelation. He swallowed, his voice suddenly tight. "What? What do you mean?" "It leaned," the penitent whispered. "Only slightly, but I know what I saw." Aurelian shut his eyes. "Perhaps," he whispered carefully, "perhaps you were tired." "No," the voice insisted. "It leaned toward me, as if listening." Aurelian's pulse throbbed in his temples. His fingers tightened around the wooden frame of the confessional. "And then," the penitent continued, "I thought I heard a whisper." "A whisper?" Aurelian's voice cracked. "Yes. It said, 'Pay attention.'" Aurelian inhaled sharply, the breath catching in his chest with painful clarity. His hands trembled. His thoughts spiraled. His heart seemed to fold inward, collapsing softly under the weight of confirmation. He managed to whisper, "My child, doubt can make us imagine many things," but the words felt false, hollow, lifeless, like old reeds used to play a broken flute. The penitent left. Aurelian remained seated, staring at the dim sliver of light on the wooden floor, feeling as though the world had tilted slightly beneath him, just enough to destabilize every belief he had relied on. From that day on, everything felt off. Prayers felt heavier, as though the words carried more weight than he could lift. Incense smelled sharper, like smoke hiding secrets. The monastery's silence grew thicker, almost tangible, as though it were no longer silence, but a presence. He began waking in the middle of the night, every night without reason, always at the same time, always with the same subtle, unsettling awareness that something was in motion, not physically, spiritually, internally, or externally. He could not tell. One night, he found himself standing, he didn't remember rising, before the chapel door, his feet bare on the icy stone floor. His breath fogging in the cold air, he pushed the door open. The chapel lay dark, silent, still except the crucifix was leaning, more clearly than ever, not dramatically, not absurdly, just enough to make denial impossible. Aurelian stared. The silence stared back, and then a sound, soft, gentle, a whisper, not words, not quite. More like the idea of a word, a breath forming intention. His heart thudded in his chest like a drum used for summoning things best left unsummoned. He whispered, "What do you want from me?" The silence answered with its usual eloquence. "Nothing. Everything. Something. It depends on the interpretation." Aurelian backed out slowly, closed the chapel door, and pressed his forehead to the wood as his breath trembled. His crisis had begun, not with lightning or visions or divine proclamations, but with an accumulation of small, inconvenient truths. He no longer trusted his senses. He no longer trusted his rituals. He no longer trusted silence. He no longer trusted certainty. He barely trusted himself. Faith, once warm and soft, now felt sharp at the edges. Doubt, once a whisper, now breathed against the back of his neck at night, not maliciously, but insistently, as if reminding him that he had asked questions he could no longer ignore. And so Aurelian stood at the threshold of a spiritual unraveling, between the world he had built and the world that was emerging, tilted, flickering, whispering, inviting him, not kindly, not cruelly, to descend. The night it finally happened, the night Aurelian's spiritual scaffolding collapsed with the quiet dignity of an old cathedral roof giving way under too much snow, began like any other night in the monastery. Cold, dim, and carrying the faint aroma of incense mixed with existential fatigue. Aurelian lay in bed, staring at the ceiling again. Sleep had become a stranger. an occasional visitor who knocked without entering. His thoughts wandered like half-blind pilgrims through unfamiliar terrain. He pressed a hand against his chest, feeling the tremor beneath his ribs, the faint quickening of a heart unsure whether it beat out of faith or fear. He whispered prayers, soft, desperate, insufficient. His voice cracked in places where it once flowed smoothly. Outside, the wind roared with unusual ferocity, as though the night itself were clearing its throat, preparing to speak. Aurelian wrapped his blanket tighter around him, but the cold found its way in, the way doubt does, quietly, insistently, without mercy. At last, unable to stand the stillness of the cell, he rose. His bare feet touched the stone floor with a shock so sharp it felt like ice biting him. He winced, but did not retreat. Something, curiosity, anxiety, divine summons, or simple madness, urged him forward. He stepped into the corridor. Dark, silent, the kind of silent that feels like thick velvet pressing against the ears. Candles flickered in their sconces with a strange, elongated sway, as though reluctant to burn upright. He had walked this corridor thousands of times, yet tonight every shadow felt new. Every corner felt watchful. Every echo felt suspiciously alive. He reached the chapel door, paused, breathed, listened. Inside, nothing. The kind of nothing that isn't empty, but waiting. He pushed the door open. The chapel was not entirely dark. Moonlight filtered in through the stained glass window, painting fractured patterns across the stone floor. Reds, blues, golds, holy colors, distorted into uneasy shapes. Aurelian stepped forward, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that sounded very much like a verdict. The air inside was colder than the corridor, almost unnaturally cold. His breath fogged out in soft clouds. His hands trembled. He approached the altar, and there it was, again, unmistakable. The crucifix leaned, but tonight, not slightly, not questionably, not in the ambiguous, plausible deniability way that doubt thrives on. No. Christ hung at a slant, so pronounced it seemed he was either falling toward Aurelian or watching him with a gaze tilted intentionally, almost accusingly. Aurelian's breath caught. His chest tightened. Something inside him, some last fragile vestige of denial, snapped like an old brittle quill. No, he whispered. No, no, no. His voice echoed in the chapel, bouncing off stone and silence. And then, because the universe has a sense of humor darker than any philosopher, the candles at the foot of the crucifix flared, not simply bright, roaring bright, as if fueled by an invisible breath. Flames surged upward, stretching like hands reaching for something beyond reach. Aurelian stumbled back, shielding his eyes. The heat hit him briefly, then vanished, leaving only cold behind. "What do you want from me?" he cried. His voice cracked open, raw and unguarded, like a confession torn from the soul rather than offered. No answer. Not immediately. Just the echo of his own voice, shaped by stone, twisted by fear. He sank to his knees, hands trembling, heart pounding, breath shaky. The crucifix creaked. A sound that did not belong to wood alone. A sound too fluid, too deliberate. Aurelian stared. Christ's head, the wooden, carved head that had known centuries of stillness, shifted. Barely at all, but enough. Enough to destroy the last certainty Aurelian possessed. He froze. His mind screamed, his body locked. His soul felt like a sheet of parchment torn in two. "Please," he whispered. "Please stop, or speak, or something." His voice trembled on that final word, dangling between hope and hysteria. The shadows deepened. The flames flickered. A strange pressure filled the room, not heavy, but pervasive, like the presence of something immense trying to fit inside a space too small. And then the whisper, soft, gentle, barely formed, not external, not internal, something between. "You are not listening." Aurelian gasped, his hand clutching, his robe near his heart. "No," he whispered. "I have been listening. You give nothing but riddles." The whisper again, "Then stop asking for answers." Aurelian shook his head violently. "I don't understand. Why show me signs I cannot interpret?" The crucifix tilted further. The candles flared again. The whisper exhaled through the space like a cold breath on the back of his neck, because certainty is not faith. His pulse hammered. His lungs tightened. His vision blurred. He cried out, "Then what is faith? Tell me plainly, just once." The chapel fell dreadfully silent, almost mercifully silent. Then the whisper, "Faith is surviving the silence." Aurelian broke, right there on the chapel floor, his forehead pressed against the stone. Tears, hot, incongruous tears, slipped down his cold cheeks. His breath shuddered. His fingers dug into the cracks between the stones as if anchoring himself to something tangible in a world that had become terrifyingly fluid. He whispered, voice torn and tiny, "Why me?" A pause. Then, like the faintest sigh of an exhausted universe, "Because you noticed." The words hit him harder than any miracle could have. He sat there, trembling, dissolving, unmade. A man stripped of certainty, a monk stripped of theological armor, a soul exposed to an enormous, indifferent, incomprehensible something. He waited for more, for clarity, for revelation, for instruction. None came. The candles dimmed, the crucifix straightened, slowly, gently, almost apologetically, and the presence, whatever it had been, lifted, as though it had simply grown bored, or satisfied, or exhausted. Who knew? Aurelian remained kneeling long after the room emptied of its strange intensity. He stayed until the moonlight faded, until morning crept in, pale and indifferent, until he, finally, felt the quiet. Not peace, not understanding, but quiet. And in that quiet, something inside him whispered back, "Nothing is the same now." Because the moment of breaking is not destruction. It is revelation, a painful, absurd, terrifying, holy unraveling. And Aurelian had unraveled, completely. Faith had shattered, doubt had flooded, and the divine, whatever form it had taken, had left him alone with the pieces, which is often the cruelest mercy, and the beginning of something else entirely. Dawn arrived without ceremony, sliding into the world like a guest who did not want to wake the household. Light seeped through the thin slit of Aurelian's window, pale and exhausted, as if it too had endured a long night of whispering with shadows. The cold lingered, not sharp now, but dull, heavy, almost companionable, like an old sorrow settling on the chest. Aurelian sat on the edge of his wooden bed, hunched forward, his hands clasped together in a grip so tight it seemed he feared they might drift away if he let go. His robe, usually an extension of his identity, felt alien against his skin. He could not quite feel his fingers, or his certainty, or his faith. It wasn't that he no longer believed. No, belief was not something one loses the way one loses a sock or a pen. Belief remained, somewhere, buried under layers of shock and confusion. But it no longer moved, no longer warmed. It was dormant, like embers beneath ash. He breathed slowly, deeply, because breathing was the only ritual left that made sense. The events of the night echoed inside him, not loudly, but with the heavy, echoing weight of a stone dropped into a deep well. He replayed everything in his mind, again and again, as if repetition might domesticate the incomprehensible, the crucifix tilting, the whisper, the silence, the unbearable clarity wrapped inside unbearable ambiguity. He felt neither closer to God nor further from Him, only suspended, hovering between two worlds belonging to neither. He stood, eventually, because his body insisted on continuing to live even when his soul hesitated. He wrapped himself in his robe, its fabric colder than usual, as though it too doubted him. He stepped into the corridor, each footstep sounding unusually loud, as if the monastery were offended by his existence this morning. The brothers moved quietly through their routines, too quietly, as if someone had instructed them to speak in whispers out of respect for something unspoken. Brother Abel glanced at Aurelian with concern, his eyes wide, soft, almost pleading. Brother Stephan looked at him as one might regard a cracked vase, still whole, but holding too much pressure. Brother Marius watched him with the suspicious delight of someone who has finally found confirmation that holiness is never as tidy as advertised. Aurelian avoided them all, not out of shame, but out of fragility. Speech felt too dangerous, words too sharp, questions too close to the surface. He went to morning prayers anyway, because habit is stronger than crisis. But the chapel, with its flickering candles and cold air, felt different. The silence was immense, the kind of silence that follows a storm, when even the echoes are tired. He bowed his head, but his posture betrayed him. Shoulders sagging, hands trembling slightly, breath uneven, the chants began, Latin rising like smoke, uncertain, thin, straining against the weight of unasked questions. Aurelian opened his mouth, but no sound came. He did not try a second time. Instead, he closed his eyes. And for the first time since childhood, he prayed without words. No petitions, no structured thoughts, no theological performance, just presence, raw, exhausted, unpolished. He felt nothing, not peace, not comfort, not divine warmth, not divine absence, just a numbness shaped like waiting. After prayers, he escaped to the courtyard. The winter sky hung low, swollen with gray, pressing down on the monastery like a contemplative hand. Snow dusted the ground lightly, shimmering in the faint sunlight. Aurelian inhaled. The cold air stabbed his lungs, sharp, metallic, but it felt honest. Honesty was a luxury these days. He walked to the fountain, its frozen basin capturing a distorted reflection of his face. He stared at himself. He looked older. He looked cracked. He looked like a man who had stared directly into something his mind was not designed to process. He whispered into the silence, "What am I now?" The fountain, being a medieval fountain, offered no philosophical insight, just a crack in the ice that resembled a question mark. Aurelian almost laughed. Almost. But the humor lodged in his throat like a stone. He exhaled slowly. His daily tasks became strange, hollow rituals, movements without meaning. He polished candlesticks. His reflection wavered in the brass, distorted, unsure as if even metal doubted his shape. He swept the cloister hallway. Each stroke of the broom felt symbolic, though of what he could not tell. Clearing doubt, sweeping away sanity, dusting the footprint of a God who refused clarity. He copied manuscript lines in the scriptorium, his handwriting wavering for the first time in years. Letters leaned, ink blotted, words bent under the weight of the hand that formed them. Brother Stephan noticed, cleared his throat softly, then, with hesitance, murmured, "Is everything well, Brother Aurelian?" Aurelian closed his eyes, breathed in, breathed out, searched the catalogue of possible lies. "I am reflecting," he answered finally. Brother Stephen nodded slowly. "Ah, reflection is good." Aurelian smiled faintly. "No, it is not." Stephan blinked. Aurelian left before more questions could form. In the afternoon, he retreated to the chapel again. He felt drawn there, not by faith, but by something heavier, more complicated. Obligation? Curiosity? A need to face the thing that had broken him? He entered quietly. The crucifix stood straight now, utterly straight, almost too straight, as if mocking the memory of the night. He stared at it for a long time, waiting, hoping, fearing. Nothing moved. The candles burned normally. The silence held, not comforting, not hostile, just silence. Aurelian's breath shook as he exhaled. "Why did you speak?" he whispered. No answer. He swallowed hard. "Why only then? Why not now?" Silence. "Why make me notice?" Silence. Aurelian clenched his fists. Doubt surged, not as a question, but as a pressure in his chest, like the weight of a stone altar crushing down. He felt the tears before they fell. Warm. Betraying. Unexpected. He wiped them away angrily. Tears were too dramatic for someone who wanted clarity. He whispered, "Say something." Silence. He whispered louder, "Anything." Silence. He shouted, breath breaking, "Don't leave me in this." The sound echoed brutally in the chapel, bouncing back at him like a reprimand. Nothing answered. Not even a flicker of candle flame. Not even a tremble of air. Aurelian collapsed onto the wooden pew, shoulders slumped, head bowed, hands limp, and there, in that suffocating quiet, something dawned on him with a cruelty so gentle it felt almost kind. Last night had not been clarity. Last night had been disruption, interruption, dislocation. He had not been given answers. He had only been given awareness. Awareness was worse. Awareness made silence unbearable. Awareness made ambiguity louder. Awareness made every movement of shadow a threat, every breath of air a reminder, every moment of prayer a battlefield. He whispered, voice small as ash, "What am I supposed to do with this?" And the silence, that great ancient indifferent silence, finally replied with its most honest answer. Nothing. Nothing certain, nothing clear, nothing comforting. You endure it. You exist with it. You learn to breathe in it. You live inside the unanswered question. Aurelian wiped his face, stood slowly and stared once more at the crucifix, straight, still, unreadable. He whispered, "You left me with the quiet." A pause. "And I suppose this is where faith begins." The realization didn't comfort him, didn't reassure him, didn't warm him. But it settled, like dust, like ash, like truth. Faith wasn't certainty. Faith wasn't warmth. Faith wasn't clarity. Faith was surviving the silence. Aurelian's crisis wasn't over. If anything, it was deepening. But now, at least, he could name the stage he had entered. The quiet after the storm. The hollow calm. The aching stillness. The part where everything felt empty. Because something had been taken away that nothing else could replace. The revelation, if revelation it truly was, did not arrive with trumpets, nor with angelic choruses, nor with any aesthetically pleasing miracle fit for illuminated manuscripts. No, it arrived in the least theological, least respectable, least spiritually photogenic moment possible. It arrived in the kitchen. And this, of course, is the cosmic joke. After all the tilting crucifixes, the cryptic whispers, the trembling candles, the spiritual earthquakes, after all that, the universe chose the smell of boiled cabbage and slightly burnt bread as the setting for its next inscrutable gesture. But that is how revelations often come. Not in beauty, but in inconvenience. not in holiness, but in hunger, not in glory, but in absurdity. Aurelian had not eaten properly in 2 days, not because he was fasting, though monks are always eager to attribute any bodily discomfort to spiritual discipline, but because his stomach had been tied in so many existential knots that food seemed irrelevant, almost offensive. But by midday his body betrayed him. Hunger, mundane, embarrassingly human hunger, gnawed at him. His hands shook. His knees felt hollow. His thoughts drifted, not toward heaven, but toward soup. So he ventured into the monastery kitchen, a room where everything smelled like steam and penance. Pots bubbled on the hearth. Baskets of winter vegetables sagged with resignation. A few loaves cooled on the table, their crusts cracked like old parchment. No one else was there. Just Aurelian, the fire, and the faintest hum of wind outside. He approached the pot of soup, if soup can be applied to a watery concoction containing 2 carrots and a theological quantity of despair. He ladled some into a bowl. His hand trembled. As he lifted the spoon to his mouth, the kitchen door creaked. Slowly, softly, like an old wooden confession opening itself. Aurelian froze. "Is someone there?" he asked. Silence. A silence too intentional to be accidental. He set the bowl down, wiped his hands on his robe, and turned. Nothing. Just shadows. Just stone. Just the faint smell of time. He exhaled. Maybe hunger was making him jumpy. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe. Then he noticed the thing on the table. A loaf of bread. Small, plain, unremarkable. Except it wasn't there a moment ago. Aurelian stared at it. The bread stared back with the smugness of starch performing a miracle. He approached slowly, as though the loaf might suddenly sprout wings or attempt a homily. He reached out, touched it. Warm, fresh, impossible. He whispered, "Who brought this?" The kitchen air did not respond. The fire crackled with suspicious innocence. Aurelian lifted the loaf. It was surprisingly heavy, as though carrying significance he had not asked for. Then he noticed something carved lightly into its crust. Not a symbol, not a sacred inscription, not a divine seal, just a word. A single word. "Look." Aurelian dropped the bread. It hit the table with a soft thud, rolled, stopped, accusing him of cowardice. He backed away, breath quickening, pulse pounding. "No," he whispered. "No more riddles, no more signs, no more—" The loaf split open, cleanly, as if cut by an unseen hand. Inside, not light, not gold, not sacred relics, but a small, folded parchment. Aurelian stared, wide-eyed, trembling. "Not again," he breathed. "Not another message. I can't—" But of course he could. And of course he did. He reached forward with cautious fingers, lifted the parchment, and unfolded it. Inside, you keep searching for clarity, but clarity is not the point. Aurelian read it twice, then a third time, as if the ink might rearrange itself into something less irritating. Clarity is not the point. He sank onto the bench, parchment limp in his hands, head bowing until his forehead touched the table. He whispered, exhausted and annoyed, "Then what is the point?" But the universe, that master of selective communication, offered only steam rising from the soup pot, curling into shapes that resembled meaning before drifting away. The ambiguity of the message settled over him like dust, heavy, inevitable, inescapable. He sat there for a long time, listening to the faint crackle of fire and the distant murmuring of monks elsewhere in the building. Eventually, he lifted his head. The bread, now in 2 halves, lay innocently on the table. The soup cooled. The parchment trembled slightly in the draught. Aurelian whispered, "This could be divine." A pause. Or coincidence. A longer pause. Or I am simply starving. And that thought, that doubt, that hilariously human explanation broke him into a quiet, exhausted laugh. Just one small laugh, barely audible, but real, because that was the terrible beauty of the moment. Was it God? Was it madness? Was it hunger, hallucination? Was it coincidence? Was it meaning? Was it nothing? The revelation, if this qualified, was perfectly ambiguous, perfectly unhelpful, perfectly divine, because ambiguity forces honesty. Ambiguity strips illusions. Ambiguity makes faith impossible to fake. Aurelian sat there, the parchment in his hand, the bread split before him, the soup forgotten, and murmured, "I don't understand." And for the first time he added, "And maybe understanding is overrated." The thought startled him more than the whisper in the chapel, more than the tilting crucifix, more than the shifting shadows, because something inside him, something quiet, steady, fragile, unclenched, just a little, barely enough to notice, but enough. He inhaled. The air felt softer, or maybe he simply stopped fighting it. He picked up the bowl of soup. He ate, slowly, thoughtfully, not because it answered anything, but because it didn't need to. He whispered, "Maybe this is all right." Not understanding, not certainty, not revelation, but something smaller, and strangely more beautiful. Aurelian finished the soup, looked once more at the split loaf, and smiled, not with joy, but with acceptance, a small, imperfect acceptance. He folded the parchment, placed it in his robe, and stood. As he left the kitchen, the fire dimmed slightly, the bread cooled, the shadows settled back into their ordinary shapes, and the universe, in its vast, mysterious indifference, remained silent, perfectly, maddeningly silent. But Aurelian felt not comfort, but steadiness. He whispered, "I will keep looking, then, even if the point is not clarity." For the first time in days, his steps felt slightly lighter, not from certainty, never that, but from something else. Faith, doubt, appetite, impossible to tell, but perhaps that was the point. Evening settled over the monastery the way dust settles over old scripture, quietly, decisively, without asking permission. The sky darkened piece by piece, like a parchment being tinted by an unseen hand. Shadows stretched along the cloisters, long and contemplative, as if they too were embroiled in the ongoing debate between faith and bewilderment. Aurelian walked slowly through the courtyard, the cold air brushing against his cheeks like the fingertips of a ghost with impeccable manners. His robe fluttered lightly behind him, catching the wind in soft breaths. There was a steadiness to his posture now, not the rigidity of certainty, nor the collapse of despair, but something in between, a middle state, a strange, fragile equilibrium, a balance between knowing and not knowing, between warmth and cold, between divine presence and divine silence. He passed the fountain again. Its surface, half frozen, reflected fragments of the sky, broken stars trapped in icy stillness. Aurelian paused, leaning over the basin. His reflection stared back at him, fractured by ripples and shards of thin ice. His face looked older, not in years, but in experience, not worn, but rewritten. He lifted a hand. The reflection lifted with him, though slightly slower, as if reluctant. "Who are you now?" he whispered to himself. No answer came, not from the reflection, not from the wind, not from the universe, but the question hovered, gentle and unresolved. After Vespers, he found himself walking toward the chapel once more, not compelled, not summoned, simply drawn. Curiosity still lived in him, though it now resembled a quiet companion rather than a tormentor. The chapel door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Inside, the candles burned in their usual solemn glow. No strange flares, no tilted symbols, no supernatural theatrics. Just stillness, just stone, just the muted fragrance of incense lingering like a memory that refused to fade. Aurelian stood at the threshold, breathing slowly. This room had broken him, and somewhere within that breaking, something else had been made possible. Not understanding, but surrender, not clarity, but willingness. He stepped forward. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet, a familiar grounding sound. He approached the crucifix, the infamous, tilting, whispering crucifix that had haunted his days and nights. It hung perfectly straight now, almost suspiciously straight, as if mocking him for expecting anything else. Aurelian stared at it for a long time. He whispered, "I'm not here for answers." His voice echoed softly, "I'm not sure I want them." A pause. A small, uncertain smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "But I am here." That felt important, more important than believing or doubting, more important than understanding or seeking. He was there, present, breathing, listening, though he no longer expected to hear anything. He sat down in a pew. Let his body relax, let his mind soften. No tension, no pleading, no celestial negotiation, just being. For the first time in many nights he felt no urgency, no panic, no need to force divine certainty into human shape. Faith had become something strangely gentle, not a shield, not a weapon, not even a comfort, a space, a quiet, puzzling, infinite space. The door opened behind him. Aurelian looked over his shoulder. Brother Abel entered softly, as though afraid to disturb the air. He approached Aurelian, his steps echoing lightly. "Brother," Abel whispered, "I noticed you left supper early." Aurelian smiled faintly. "I wasn't hungry." Abel nodded slowly. "You seem different." "Do I?" "Yes, calmer, but also distant, as if you were listening to something none of us can hear." Aurelian exhaled, eyes softening. "I think I am listening to nothing." Abel sat beside him. "Nothing?" "Yes," Aurelian answered. "The silence. The space where certainty used to be." Abel considered this quietly, then asked, with genuine concern, "Is it frightening?" Aurelian shook his head. It was. Terrifying. Like standing on the edge of an abyss without knowing how far the fall would be. But now, he looked at the crucifix again. Now, it feels like the abyss is simply part of the landscape. Abel frowned. "I don't understand." "Neither do I," Aurelian replied, "and that is finally all right." They sat together in silence. Two monks, two souls, two beings suspended in a universe that rarely spoke plainly. Then Abel, after a moment, whispered, "You ever wonder if God gets overwhelmed by all our questions?" Aurelian laughed. Quietly, warmly, unexpectedly. Perhaps he avoids them like we avoid Brother Marius when he begins quoting scripture before breakfast. Abel grinned. Their laughter, soft and fragile, floated through the chapel like a candle flame refusing to die out. When Abel left, Aurelian remained. He waited. Not for signs, not for miracles, not for whispers, for nothing. And the nothing, strangely, no longer felt empty. He rested a hand on the wooden pew. Its surface was smooth from centuries of prayers, confessions, doubts, revelations, and ordinary human worries. He imagined the generations before him, monks whose faith had cracked, who had wandered through their own deserts of ambiguity. Perhaps this journey was not unique. Perhaps doubt was less an enemy and more a rite of passage. Perhaps faith was less about believing confidently and more about walking forward even when everything tilts. Aurelian breathed deeply, The air felt warmer now, or perhaps he had simply stopped bracing against the cold. He whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe this is enough." Not understanding, not certainty, not revelation, not a straightened path, but presence, humility, endurance, and the strange, quiet dignity of existing in a universe that refused to simplify itself for his comfort. He stood slowly and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, the crucifix creaked behind him, just once, softly, ambiguously, questionably. Aurelian froze, turned slightly, stared into the dim interior. Nothing moved. Perhaps it had been the wood settling, perhaps the wind, perhaps exhaustion playing tricks, or perhaps not. He smiled, tired, wise, lightly amused. "Maybe you're listening," he whispered. "Or maybe you're avoiding messages, like everyone does on Mondays." He pulled the door open. The cold air greeted him like an old friend. He stepped out, the shadows enveloping him gently. Everything was unresolved. Everything was open. Everything was uncertain. But for the first time in a long while, he felt ready. Ready for the silence. Ready for the questions. Ready for whatever strange, absurd, divine bureaucracy governed the world. He walked into the night, breathing deeply, aware of every sensation, the crunch of snow, the hum of distant wind, the warmth of his own breath against the cold. Somewhere, in the quiet tapestry of the monastery, a candle flickered. Somewhere a wooden cross leaned, or didn't, depending on interpretation. And somewhere within Aurelian's heart a small, steady flame began to live again. Not bright, not certain, but alive. Night draped itself over the monastery like a heavy velvet curtain, dark, plush, and saturated with the secrets it had no intention of sharing. The wind quieted at last, no longer roaring its existential grievances, but humming softly through the cracks in the stone walls, as if offering a lullaby to anyone brave enough to stay awake. Aurelian moved slowly through the cloister one last time that night. Not urgently, not fearfully, but with the rhythm of someone who had finally learned to walk alongside his questions instead of ahead of them. The lantern he carried cast a faint circle of amber light around him, flickering with the unsteady confidence of a flame that understood both its power and its fragility. Dust motes floated lazily in the glow, small golden orbs suspended in the air like tiny, indecisive planets. He paused in the archway leading to the courtyard. Moonlight bathed the snow-covered stones in pale silver, giving the world a ghostly serenity. The sky above, veiled by the thin breaths of winter clouds, looked like an ancient scroll, faded, cracked, unreadable. Aurelian inhaled the cold night air deeply. For once, the cold didn't feel hostile. It felt clean, honest, direct, a clarity he could trust more than visions. He raised his lantern slightly, watching the shadows gather around it, attentive and gentle, like stray thoughts that had been wandering too long. The silence embraced him, familiar now, no longer the oppressive silence of abandoned certainty, but the spacious, contemplative silence of possibility. As he walked toward the small bench beside the frozen fountain, his robe brushed lightly against the stone path, whispering soft frictions that sounded almost like prayer. He sat, feeling the bench's chill through the fabric, letting it settle into his bones without resistance. He reached into his robe and pulled out the parchment from the bread loaf. He unfolded it slowly, carefully. Its edges were stiff with cold, but the ink remained crisp. You keep searching for clarity, but clarity is not the point. Aurelian read it again, as though for the first time. He smiled, not with certainty, but with understanding. A small understanding, a human understanding. An understanding shaped like acceptance, not revelation. Perhaps, he murmured into the night, clarity would ruin the whole thing. His breath fogged the air. The parchment trembled lightly in his hand. The fountain's frozen surface gleamed back at him, fractured, shimmering, resisting definition. He looked up at the sky. If God was listening, he wasn't making a show of it. Which, Aurelian decided, was exactly the kind of divine behavior he could now appreciate. After all, any deity worth believing in was probably too busy or too polite to offer loud, theatrical answers every time a monk panicked about tilted wood. Aurelian closed his eyes, not to pray, not to ask, not to interpret, just to rest. Rest in the ambiguity, rest in the silence, rest in the ridiculous, beautiful absurdity of being alive in a universe that refused to footnote itself. Minutes passed, or hours. Time, being a reluctant servant of the contemplative mind, blurred around him. Eventually, he stood. He tucked the parchment back into his robe. He extinguished his lantern, letting the dark reclaim the space. And as he walked back to his cell, he didn't flinch at the cold. He didn't fear the shadows. He didn't brace for whispers. Because he knew now, profoundly, ironically, that the mystery was not a test to be solved, but a companion to be acknowledged. He climbed into his narrow bed. The straw mattress rustled beneath him. The thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders like an old, loyal doubt. He stared into the darkness. Calm, present, awake. A single candle flickered on the table beside him, its flame bending gently, almost bowing as though returning his gaze. Dust floated through the air, shimmering in the slightest movement, beautiful in its aimlessness. Aurelian whispered, half laughing, half sighing, "So, this is faith, or insomnia. Either way, I suppose it works." And with that, the candle dimmed, shrinking into a thin thread of light. The last spark trembled, gold against the dark, then vanished, leaving only the quiet, the cold, the soft rhythm of breathing, and the lingering question of whether the universe had spoken tonight, or simply allowed him to hear himself. Aurelian smiled into the silence. Whatever it was, whatever had tilted, whispered, broken, revealed, it was enough. Not everything, just enough. And sometimes that's all a soul needs. The monastery slept. The night exhaled. And faith, poor, tired, absurd, beautiful faith, kept its vigil, somewhere between certainty and unknowing, between the cold stone and the warmth of breath. A monk found rest. And perhaps, somewhere far beyond the stars, a very patient God looked down, smiled a tired smile, and whispered,